Anyone has it? There's a lot of ours.
Gracious silence.
Right. What do you guys want? Nuggets? Nuggets. Okay, so guys, I'll quickly give it to you right back to your spot. Here, no, yeah, here. Go, you go sit down, Cole. There you go. No, leave it there. Left one on the right. Allah, Father of the universe. Allah, Father of the universe. Father of love. Father of love. Truth. Peace. Freedom. And justice. Allah is my protector. My guide. And my salvation. By night. And by day. To his holy prophet. No Ujwali. Islam. So, what was it on TV you're watching? Yeah, it was like about 2 weeks ago. I just happened to be, I'm sure we all have these times when something just happens and you know it's, now that you're sort of awake, you sort of see it being something, you know, sort of divine or at least something that you are, there's something that stands out. So I was flipping through the channels and it said Reconstruction, America after the Civil War. And I obviously had some brothers on it. Most of the time before this knowledge, I would have thought it was talking about some Civil War stuff, America and Spain, not connecting the fact that that was us, and that it was really about, we're really talking about the Moors, and then but they're really substituting in black and thing. It was wild to watch this thing now with my eyes open, realizing what they were telling us, reconfirming everything that that we've been told from there. And since it seems that we need them to tell us some shit, this reconfirmed everything to me. But then underneath it, you realize that there was, and this is where I think some of Cujo's, maybe some of his extensive knowledge can tie into sort of, you know, they were talking about the blacks wanting nationality in America, but they weren't telling me what that nationality was. They weren't telling what the significance between what they were considering to be Americans and non-Americans and Negroes. And then once you realize that those were all brands and stuff, but it's wild, I'm telling you. So Cujo and I think that this might be, as well as being outside in the parks this summer, doing some lectures and sitting down hopefully in some nice outside spots to get some of that shit. We're also thinking about doing maybe some, you know, maybe one can just have a sign-up sheet and then, you know, certain videos, and we can pick a lecture or a DVD or something, and we can do this, right? Break some of that knowledge down. But anyways, this I thought, and you can tell me afterwards whether this was a waste, but or you can stop it.
Yeah.
Through, but
so what the plan is as we're going through it, if anybody has something comes to mind or whatever, we'll stop it and build on.
Well, know this, it's about a 2-hour thing,
yeah,
so
about an hour 40 or something like that.
So know this, it's
so it might be, you know, we do how much we do today. If we don't finish, we continue it next week or whatever. Because it's the things on YouTube, so we can do it like that.
Very good.
And yeah, so this is going to be what Sunday is it? This is the last Sunday. Right? So
last Sunday.
Yeah, so we'll do last Sunday.
Every
last Sunday is going to be one of these. So look for your documentaries and whatever that you're out there studying, researching or whatever.
Right.
So that we can do a little bit more of this.
Come through here.
For quote unquote class.
For now, right?
This is
the spring.
Spring forward. Spring forward
initiative.
Changing up those vibes a little bit. The other thing, as we're going through it, we find any more, any things relative to information as well. Don't forget to print out whatever it is and bring those things in too, so that we can get everybody's input as far as the museum perspective. Everything, like we say, everything that's coming through is going to be checked, vetted, or whatever before we say, yeah, we're going to put up whatever. But if you find any info or any lectures, DVDs, documentaries, whatever that you think is absolutely relative to us building on. Bring those things.
I was just saying, just from the perspective too, that, I mean, we're sort of late into the springing forward, we're coming into the summer, but looking at this from the perspective that this is sort of somewhat, or not somewhat, is one of our New Year's. And thinking about things that we're going to want to start expanding on. This is the theme for this sort of time period right now. And what's our next step? So you can put that, you can all put that sort of, you can sort of flavor or color all of, where your energy is going towards. What do we want to do as a nation moving forward in this continuum? As I said, we had the Clean the Streets yesterday.
The long-term ones that help out with that.
Right? And, we have the pictures, so we have the proof of who was there and who wasn't there. But some of these things, and from my perspective, speak to us having some kind of national standard. Something. And depending on what you're here for, if you're looking at the benefits only going to come from the cohesiveness of the nation. And if you're here for nationality stuff, then you were probably there yesterday from a certain perspective. And I don't mean to say that like that, but it's going to be that type of mindset that we're going to need to move forward. It's long.
It's long. So speaking about that, you're going to say something? Speaking about the covenant idea, or there's no issue with wanting to get whatever benefits this has to offer, but know that something comes before that, before the benefit could be received or exercised. There's something that comes before, and the commitment, what comes before? Chapter 25, what comes before? The fact that we're supposed to be dealing with each other on certain levels.
Chapter 3.
So, yeah, I mean the whole book, but the 2007 Moorish American Treaty of Peace and Friendship that we had floating around, maybe one up there still. Yeah. We printed out a vinyl version, and then this one has the signature or autograph lines on there. So this is that commitment that we're talking about. You don't have to sign right away or anything like that, but it's going to be up there. And when you think that you're, for example, Brother Yasuin's probably 9 years this in the movement? 11? Okay, so 11 years, me 11 years, Omar 7 or 8, right? Mocha from the start, people who you might not see all the time, but when time comes, they're here. They did this without the signature, that's why they're still here, still. Right? Now, there's many people that fell off this. Many that fell off this. So, go ahead, Mark.
I just want to say that I don't know where you're saying about putting that up there, but I think that before anyone puts their so-called, before that's even offered, there has to be a certain, in my mind.
This is it right here. If you can't abide by this, then it shows the commitment. Because like I said, in 2007, this was real simple. Abide by the principles. No withdrawal, you already brought everything. This is not anything, you got to make up any new things or anything like that. It's the baseline commitment to this. That we can tell you that, and Brother Hiru as well, been around. Right? We can tell you how many people came in and left. I can tell you how many people that had problems, called me, got out the problems, and I haven't seen them since that time. Mad people. They ain't no big deal, it is what it is. Man. People are going to do whatever they want with the birthright, it's theirs. But if you read about your birthright, the things right here, read it over a few times, familiarize yourself with whatever is being presented there, it would be, after we're gonna get the grommets in it and get it up, you put down your stuff and go from there. You have anything else to play here, brother Yassin?
Well, I didn't want to, not really to add to that, but aside from that, like, I want to try to implement the, like we were talking about, kind of the reading of the Quran in Circle 7 at some point, like maybe some, after we read the letters that were supposed to read, to do a passage or something, and you guys spoke about 25 and 35, so I don't know, maybe I could set up before we start and
Yeah.
start with passage 25. So yeah, every week I'd like to implement this and dissect it and start to learn from it and build from it. And come to a mutual understanding of what's going on, or get each other's perspectives, because we each are gonna interpret it somewhat in different ways too, right? So
Yeah.
come to one common ground and figure out exactly what the prophet. This book has many uses, right? So I try to utilize it for what it's for.
Yeah.
What are you gonna say, Omar?
Just in terms of how in-depth we're gonna get maybe today, right now, because of the video that I'm hoping we can get a little bit something into, but I agree with you. What maybe the video can then take a,
I just want to read it, bro. That's all I want to do. Alright? Can read it? Chapter 25, it's probably like 5 verses. Cool? Holy Covenant of the Asiatic Nation. Islam.
Islam.
Ye are the children of one Father, provided for by his care, and the breast of one mother hath given you suck. Let the bonds of affection therefore unite thee with the brothers, that peace and happiness may dwell in thy father's house. And when ye separate in the world, remember the relation that bindeth you to love and unity, and prefer not a stranger before thine own blood, or thy own blood. If thy brother is in adversity, assist him. If thy sister is in trouble, forsake her not. So shall the fortunes of thy father contribute to the support of this whole race, and his care be continued to you all in your love to each other. Islam.
Islam. And don't forget, class time is going to be 1 now instead of 12, so you can get the...
she wanna play the part.
And any dues and donations, you can also get those in as well to Brother Omar.
You're going to read the letters now or no?
I didn't even bring the book today, I forgot the book home. So this is on Reconstruction, America after the Civil War. And then also too, you already know it's going to be full of colorable language or whatever, but there's also lots of study points in it.
Yeah.
So take down some notes because there's some stuff in there. They don't go into detail in things, but they mention stuff that,
Jump around.
yeah, they jump around a lot in this thing. Like they jump around, but they jump to some good things. So.
On the evening of June 17, 2010, a stranger walked into an historic black church in Charleston, South Carolina, known as Mother and Manuel. He prayed with the Wednesday night Bible study group for almost an hour. Then, he opened fire.
We have 9 victims, and I do believe this was a hate crime.
Friends say the 21-year-old high school dropout was a loner, an unabashed racist with a deep hatred for black people.
he just said, I have to do it. He said, you rape our women and you're taking over our country.
The massacre in Charleston touched off not only a debate over the Confederate flag, but it touched off a debate all over the country. How did we get here? And why has this happened?
It was easy, I guess, to think of that as a singular horror. And it was convenient, I think, to think of it that way. Unless you really wanted to understand how this could happen. And then that meant that you had to get into the history.
Most of us know that our country fought a civil war in the 1860s. But less is known about what came afterward. The chaotic, exhilarating, and ultimately devastating period known as Reconstruction. If we're looking for the roots of the tragedy at Mother Emanuel, this is where we have to start.
The Reconstruction period is one of extraordinary excitement. The time when America could finally become that land of freedom that it had promised to be since the very beginning.
Black people actually sat in the House of Representatives and the Senate, poor whites, and black people saw a common cause with one another.
You're seeing this opportunity and imagining that will only...
One thing that came to mind in that first part, the blacks and the poor whites, was that's the King Alfred plan language too.
When we said poor whites and blacks, I think that's how
Yeah.
she actually started. It's almost like she added blacks in to cover the
Yeah.
right?
Oh, they're the same people.
Right?
Well, on one level,
Even on that level,
Yeah,
like,
look at it, yeah, too.
you know what I mean? You can look at that level too, right?
No, here's
that
what
they weren't.
the level I'm looking at. She's assigning the European the white. So she's really telling you that it was really the Europeans who were the poor shit. Because just before that, they were just telling you how blacks were in Congress and in the House of Representatives. But they're not telling you that it was our country. You see what you're missing, like the layering. They're telling you at a certain point.
But the underlying meaning, he could be right. Like it could be
Yeah,
deeper.
absolutely.
It could be deeper, and they're actually talking about Moors when they're talking about whites, or just people who are not.
Yeah, but I'm saying, watch how
Yes.
confusing it is from the perspective that they've just told you that they've been the hierarchy. Just the sentence before, they just told you they were congressmen, and they were, that's the highest sort of levels, that's right? And then they're telling you about the poor whites and the blacks.
Yeah.
So who exactly is that, right? So then they're throwing in symbology again to mess you up. Because now, who's the poor whites? Well, couldn't have been the blacks they were just talking about, right? That's how later, they were Congress, but they were, remember this, they weren't blacks, they were Moors. That's what they're not telling you. That's the stuff that they're mixing your mind with. So you know who's poor black, who's poor white, remember this. White is purity, and black is bleak, which is still white. From a certain sense, right? If you're looking at how that represents. Anyways,
The Reconstruction period is one of extraordinary excitement. The time when America could finally become that land of freedom that it had promised to be since the very beginning.
Black people actually sat in the House of Representatives and the Senate, poor whites, and black people saw a common cause with one another.
You're seeing this opportunity and imagining that will only get better. And looking back, what we know is those black folks had no idea of the cliff that they were heading towards. The achievements of Reconstruction triggered a fearsome backlash, an onslaught of terror and depression that lasted for decades.
After 250 years of slavery, white Southerners could not quite accept the 4 million former slaves as equal members of their society.
Violence is used in conjunction with Jim Crow in order to strip African Americans of the rights and privileges they gained during Reconstruction. The Charleston Massacre comes from a long history of white terror against African Americans.
But Reconstruction left a legacy of hope,
so
as well as
like
violence. Yeah.
So they call them blacks, and then they call them African Americans. Right, so then,
What is your receipt? They're just coloring nonstop.
Well, that's right, but they're also, I think, also pointing out people. Those are the Moors that they're talking about. Right? Well, they're talking about the Mongolians. Go on, please.
And also too with the African American. That's not what those people in the pictures. They were talking African American back then.
Those colored people, they weren't African American.
That term didn't exist yet.
They're trying to make it retro.
But that term, yeah, that term only came with Jesse Jackson. Right? That's like the conscious black whatever in the black whoever of Egypt. That they're trying to retroactive the word so that it fits into their paradigm of their history so they can have something. When really well, they weren't African American, they weren't Negroes, they weren't black people. Those other people weren't white people, whether they look like us or look like European, they weren't white either, right? Everybody came from somewhere and had some type of geographical location that they should be putting themselves forward.
Recognize the injustices that were inflicted, but we can't reduce all history to that injustice. People who have been held in perpetual bondage confronted the greatest sin of American history straight on.
Their hopes were far greater than maybe what any government can accomplish. A system functioning without race being a barrier to equality. We still haven't quite gotten there.
Almost a century and a half later, we still find ourselves haunted by the collapse of Reconstruction, a chapter of our history that's often been misrepresented and misunderstood. It's time that we acknowledge the true story and complete the work of reconstructing America. When I was in high school, Black history consisted of a few simple facts and a very happy ending. Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves. But this was the 1960s. 100 years after emancipation, Black people were fighting for the most basic rights. So what happened to that happy ending? It turns out that wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. April 9th, 1865, Palm Sunday. At the village of Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia, Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to United States Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant. Lee's capitulation effectively signaled the end of the Civil War and the death of slavery in the United States. The news rippled out from Appomattox.
A strange woman I'd never seen before came running down where we were all at work. She said as loud as she could, "Hey, freedom, you are free." Everybody was getting up his clothes and leaving. They didn't know where they was going. Just scattering around.
It was just like opening the door and letting the bird fly out. He might starve or freeze or be killed pretty soon, but he just felt good because he was free.
To a remarkable degree, it was the slaves themselves who had helped bring this to pass. From the war's first days, legions of enslaved people defied their masters and fled to Union lines. Others were liberated by the United States Army as it occupied parts of the South. By the summer of 1862, many thousands of slaves had found safe haven. Their brave actions, as much as any other factor, converted President Lincoln and many other Americans to emancipation. When Black men were finally allowed to enlist in the Union Army, 180,000 answered the call. Most of it.
Also remember too, that when they never show it as a positive with Moors in this context. When they go around showing pictures, oh yeah, these guys are Mussolini's army, I have guys with fezzes and, you know, King whoever, and when they went to the Congo, they had guys with fezzes with them, and those were the Moors who are they're not looking at these guys like that. They're working with the Union. They're working with the Europeans. They're going to the Europeans' army to go fight. They're those people's war. That has nothing to do with them in that context. Because they don't have to go. They decide as opportunity to get out of slavery. Hey, we can get out of slavery? Let's go fight with these guys. You know, but just bring it up. As I saw him, this just hit me right now. That, oh yeah, that's the same thing with the war. They try to pull, you know.
Those are their black guys.
Yeah.
If the ones with fezzes, who they're claiming are sellouts, were saying they were black, then they'll probably try to defend them.
Yeah.
They're, you know, just their emotionalism attached to the name.
Yeah.
If they go more into the fezzes or calling themselves black, they'll find a way to defend them.
Yeah.
And say they were being brainwashed or something.
Them former slaves.
It was both the manpower that they brought to the Union side and also the denial of their manpower in the production of the Southern economy.
There's no question that they strengthened the Union hand militarily, and they changed the nature of what a military victory would mean. The role of black soldiers, Lincoln said this himself, was essentially in ensuring that the war would end with the abolition of slavery.
What would the future hold for these free people? Now in Kevin, their status as citizens is very much in question. With few legal rights and protections guaranteed. Even so, prayers of generations were being answered. As William Grant negotiated the terms of surrender, the governor in Washington was what was being called Reconstruction. On the surface, Reconstruction just meant restoring the rebel states to the Union. In fact, it raised a host of questions.
Reconstruction is the process by which American society, North, South, black, white, tried to come to terms with the consequences of the Civil War, the reunion of the nation, the destruction of slavery, the question of what the status of the 4 million former slaves would be as free people in American life.
One of the first questions that the post-war period has to confront is who is a citizen, and then what rights attend to citizenship? Who are former slaves going to be in the body politic?
In parts of the South that the Army liberated during the war, officials have been confronted with issues like education, land ownership, and workers' rights. Even at Appomattox, it was apparent that the North and the South saw Reconstruction quite differently.
Grant goes into these negotiations thinking, well, we won. Not just militarily, but our principles won. Robert E. Lee comes into it thinking, it shows that you had more men and more cannon than we did. We acknowledge no wrong. And they just talk right past each other, which is one reason it becomes not the end of all this struggle, but in some ways the beginning.
These ideas start to accumulate around Appomattox of a merciful coming together of peace. Many iconic images associate the surrender ceremony with Jesus entering the city of Jerusalem, the city of peace, but they don't actually help us understand what happened there at all. Whatever Appomattox is, it's not the start of peace.
2 days after Appomattox, Abraham Lincoln spoke about Reconstruction at the White House. For the first time in public, the president suggested that some black men, the very intelligent, and black veterans deserved the right to vote. A man in the audience turned to his companion and said, "That is the last speech he will ever make." On April 14, 1865, Good Friday, John Wilkes Booth made good on his threat. The reckoning for America's original sin was just beginning. The early days of freedom were a bewildering mixture of exhilaration and apprehension. But the first
first order of business was to reconnect with family members who had been torn away by slavery.
Information wanted. I had 2 children sold from me about 10 years ago by a man by the name of Pate. My boy's name was Monroe Early, and my daughter's name, Mary Early.
Starting in 1865, so shortly after the end of the war, you see people placing ads in newspapers. It really gives a sense of the...
Another point, when they're talking about this thing of the institution of slavery and then the selling of breaking up the families or whatever like that, they're not talking about Africa ever at all. There's slaves from Africa that came over here, and their first thing should be trying to tie, how do we get back across over there? Because without bringing up the quote-unquote term slavery, as soon as they bring that up, then the boats and all that stuff come in. If they don't say that word slavery, then you're talking about a totally different institution that was going on. That has nothing to do with bringing people over here or whatever. It has to do everything with people coming over here and, you know, quote unquote, reconstructing how the system was running here.
Hold on, just to interject, is that any different than the residential school systems that were happening here?
Right.
Is that what that is?
Right. Same exact same system.
Same thing, and it's happening right now.
Right here.
Yes.
Still.
The separation that had occurred during slavery.
Information wanted. Of my father, Jerry Hodges of Norfolk County, Virginia. I was sold from him when I was a small girl, about 30 years ago. My mother's name was Phoebe, and she belonged to a man named Ashcroft.
This moment of emancipation is a serious moment of upheaval. A lot of people are moving about. There are a lot of things that are going on. But for African Americans, one of their big things is to try to build the lives that they've been thinking about while they're enslaved.
People took to the roads trying to find family members. I mean, literally walking to where they had last left family.
Information wanted of my children, Louis, Lizzie, and Kate Mason, whom I last saw in Owensboro, Kentucky. They were then owned by David and John Hart, that is, the girls were. But the boy was rather the property of Thomas Pointer.
Imagine keeping this memory of your child or your wife or your husband, your father, your mother, alive in your mind and in your heart, and then trying to bring about some kind of reunification. But you hardly know where to start.
The end of the Civil War brought more questions than answers. Even the status of slavery was unresolved. The 13th Amendment passed Congress in January, but it hadn't been ratified by the states. And what did freedom mean? Could the freed people be citizens? Were they entitled to a role in politics? Could they earn wages in the free market? It was a dangerous time that would have tested the abilities of even the greatest president. Just hours after Lincoln's death, Andrew Johnson was sworn in at a hotel on Pennsylvania Avenue. When Lincoln chose a Southern Unionist Democrat as his running mate in 1864, few imagined that Johnson would ever ascend to the presidency.
During Reconstruction, the Republican Party is the party of civil rights. It is the party that promotes a vision of an interracial democracy. The Republican Party is the party of African Americans.
Although Johnson was a Southerner and a Democrat, he had opposed secession, even at the risk of his life.
Andrew Johnson grew up a poor white Southerner. He believed very strongly that the Civil War had been caused by the planter class, the Southern elite, and he hated them. But he imagined that the primary victim of the planter class was the class to which he belonged, the poor whites of the South.
Andrew Johnson was the first man in this country made president by an assassin's bullet. He wouldn't be shy about using his newly gained power.
Congress had gavelled out of session in March. They're not coming back till December. Out of session, they're stuck, and Johnson is in the driver's seat.
The most famous black man in America, the abolitionist Frederick Douglass, had his doubts about the new president.
At Lincoln's second inaugural, Johnson meets with Frederick Douglass. When
I remember also too that the story of Frederick Douglass and him getting out of slavery was him borrowing a freedman's papers. So he found a freedman that had papers and borrowed his papers, got out of slavery, and then sent the guy back his papers. Right. And then like what they said, he's classified to them as he's the black guy. That is the black guy as far as the slaves are concerned.
Poor and wicked black.
Right? Because he came out of it. And he didn't get out of it by being a dumb nigger. Like he got himself intelligent and got himself out of it.
Johnson realizes that he has to shake a black man's hand, his smile turns into a scowl. Douglass smells the liquor on his breath. He's already drunk at 11 a.m. Douglass says to his friend, no matter what else Andrew Johnson is, he is no friend of the black.
Even as the freed people celebrated the death of slavery, Douglass was forced to wonder, in what new skin will the old slave come forth? The freed people long for all of those things that other people enjoy. Things denied them under slavery. The right to marry, the right to make a home, the right to an education, and the right to earn a living. For many, the basis of being truly free was the right to own land. In the summer of 1865, the question of land was very much on the mind of Major General Oliver Howard. That May, Howard had been given one of the most daunting assignments in American history. As the head of a new government agency, the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, Howard was given a few hundred agents and then charged with overseeing the entire transition of Southern society from slavery to freedom.
The Freedmen's Bureau was supposed to protect blacks from violence. It was supposed to give them access to education. It was supposed to, in some way, get them access to land. It was supposed to make sure that local courts treated blacks fairly. White Southerners deeply resented the Freedmen's Bureau, even though they were not there to quite protect the former slaves, just to make sure that relations between white and black were fair and equitable on both sides.
The federal government never done anything like this. The budget of the Freedmen's Bureau on an annual basis was not much more than what it cost to fight the Civil War for 1 week.
Though having limited resources, what the Freedmen's Bureau had plenty of was land. Over 850,000 acres of it. And Howard sensibly wanted the freedmen to have use of it.
During the Civil War, a lot of land came into the hands of the federal government. Some of it was seized for non-payment of taxes. Some of it was just abandoned by planters who fled when the Union Army appeared. The Freedmen's Bureau was to oversee this land.
At the end of July, General Howard ordered his agents to begin renting out 40-acre plots. The freedmen would have 3 years to buy the land outright.
Of course, this phrase, 40 acres and a mule, was picked up by African Americans all around the South. Many people thought this was a blueprint for Reconstruction.
But within weeks, Howard's plans were in trouble.
Johnson's Reconstruction plan, which he put forward in May of 1865, basically gave amnesty to most white Southerners who would take an oath to the Union and also accept the end of slavery. But he said those who own $20,000 worth of property before the war are not going to be covered by a blanket pardon. They have to come and get an individual pardon from the president.
Johnson also began setting up new state governments in the former Confederacy.
President Johnson had a very soft version of Reconstruction, almost like
Southerners who would take an oath to the Union and also accept the end of slavery. But he said those who own $20,000 worth of property before the war are not going to be covered by a blanket pardon. They have to come and get an individual pardon from the president.
Johnson also began setting.
Now look where New Mexico is, and then Texas, and then right under Texas. Now look at Louisiana. That's supposed to be Ouachita, Louisiana, Mississippi, Arkansas, Missouri, Illinois, Indiana, going all up there. Europeans are supposed to be only in New York, Pennsylvania, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia. They're not even supposed to be that far in the mainland, talking about Arkansas and Tennessee and whatever. Right?
Supposed to remain by the coast?
Next to Arkansas, you see that place called Indian Territory right there, which again gives up, you know, what do you mean Indian Territory? And of course too, when they're telling the story, they have it set up so that the angle that they're presenting is in the forefront. But just like what Brother Owen said, there's so much different stuff layered right there that could go off into wherever for an hour. You know what I mean? Like all these different things that they're just throwing out, especially when you have like these documentaries with Louis Gossett Jr. and them ones.
Yeah.
Right?
You know it's been sold up.
Yes, you know already that they have their agenda. You know they have their agenda.
But yeah, that's where like even going back to when they were talking about the Republican government, and the government being the government for the civil rights.
Right, yeah.
They were tying the real Republican government, which was the de jure one, in with the fraud. So they're really reconstructing history with this very video, kind of claiming that it's correct. But of course, history is then being written by people telling the story, so to speak, right? Doesn't mean the story is the real deal. But as I said, as I continued to watch it, it just kept showing me nuggets, at least even on the surface, of how much, where we're at still, 180 years later. No.
Setting up new state governments in the former Confederacy.
President Johnson had a very soft version of Reconstruction, almost like a restoration of the Southern states.
White Southerners have to accept the fact that slavery is dead. But other than that, Johnson was giving them a free hand in keeping the black population under control.
Many Republicans worried that Johnson was undermining the result of the war, but there wasn't much they could do because Congress was in recess.
Johnson felt that he could handle Reconstruction perfectly well, and it would all be done by the time Congress came back into session in December 1865.
In May, Andrew Johnson decreed that wealthy rebels would only be pardoned if they appealed in person to him. All through the summer of 1865, a steady stream of prominent Southerners, the very people Johnson loathed, called at the White House to beg the president's forgiveness.
This was a poor boy who was not recognized among
Well, the one I was asking is that when they're in recess, it means that the government was on pause. And I was saying to him, yeah. So what the guy's doing, which is what we're talking about, is the end around, where the real government would have probably stopped all of this. He's doing it on the slide. Right? And what you're showing there, what you're seeing there, is he's obviously taking some bribes. He's getting all the rich rebels to come and meet him. When the meetings, when the general meeting's done, I'll meet with all the rich rebels. Well, what is that saying to you?
It's not formal at all. He's a Democrat, right?
Well, but remember, you're talking about politics as if they're representative of anything on the surface. Is he a person that wants to see us back? Is he a humanitarian, or is he, or is he, or is he a guy filled with greed, right? Whatever that is.
Yeah.
So yeah, so it wasn't recess, and then what he was doing was basically taking his little payoffs to then have those same criminals back on the land, probably. I don't know yet.
And then remember, once we're talking about Lincoln and Jackson and these people, we're talking about after we were the ones who were running Congress. Right? This is already long past when we were ruling it, and now they're in the seat, and slavery's done now. So now they have to find something to do with all these people that are just out here that they never had to account to before because they were property. You know, I mean, this is the thing where, you know, okay, well now they have to bring these different amendments now because they have to accommodate to the slaves that got freed and all that stuff. When all these people were Aboriginal, indigenous people, they had their own government going on the map. They showed you Indian territory. So you know that there are some people doing something other than what these people are doing as far as the blacks and the whites playing the whole slavery and the, you know, government, United States government, whatever game, Republican, Democrat, whatever, right? The real us being in Congress was Continental Congress, not Congress that they're talking about in this. That we had some power or we want to put our mouth in and say something or whatever. That's not with this. But it goes on. It'll get to us, our involvement during this time. You know what I mean?
And I just want to speak too, from the perspective that I think we've already been brainwashed, thinking that somehow they had brought us over on a boat. To me, I'm more likening this to be, there was a war, a civil war happening on the streets. Once the commander said everything's good, there was an agreement made that, okay, you're not just going to slaughter people. So what happens? We naturally just became slaves. So it wasn't the slavery of them bringing us over here, it was more the slaves of the people on the land. Where right now, instead of it being the cops, let's say it was some Russian guys came in here and they were like, now they're the ones running the show. So we're just going to follow along or go to our jobs, our slave things, just to keep stuff going. But really what it was the loss. That's where America against Britain, that was the battle. Right? But the Americans were us. They were the Moors. They weren't the Europeans that they're trying to write into it. Right? So that's how I saw that sort of manifesting.
Daily class when he was in Tennessee. People that he had hated are now coming to him and asking for pardons, and he liked it.
By the end of the summer of 1865, many of the former Confederates who took the South out of the Union have received presidential pardons, which means they are back in American society. They could vote. They get to make whatever laws they want. And there's nothing you can do about that.
In September, Johnson ordered Howard to restore almost all of the lands in the hands of the Freedmen's Bureau back to the Confederates he had pardoned.
It fell to Oliver Howard to go and inform free people that they were probably going to have to start entering into labor contracts with, in many cases, their former owners.
Howard knew he had to deliver this devastating news in person, in places like Edisto Island on the South Carolina coast.
They could not believe it, and so they refused to leave. The free people started shouting, "No, no," and then an old woman started singing, "Nobody knows the troubles I've seen," and everyone in this church starts singing that song. And Howard is just devastated.
The Edisto Islanders desperately appealed directly to the president.
We were the only true and loyal people that were found in possession of these lands. We have always been ready to fight if needs be to preserve this glorious union. Will a good and just government take from us all this right and make us subject to the will?
Nobody knows the troubles I've seen. And everyone in this church starts singing that song. And Howard is just devastated.
The Edisto Islanders desperately appealed directly to the president.
We were the only true and loyal people that were found in possession of these lands. We have always been ready to fight if needs be to preserve this glorious union. Will a good and just government take from us all this right and make us subject to the will of those who have cheated and oppressed us? We look to you in this trying hour as a true friend of the poor and neglected race.
Their plea went unanswered.
The United States had the opportunity at that time to make amends for centuries of enslavement. The United States had the opportunity to make it possible for the formerly enslaved people to be economically independent. And the country failed to do it. By not redistributing that land, it consigned most of them to a dependence that remained for decades afterwards. And we're still dealing with the fallout from that.
How'd you get involved with this, the planning of this monument?
More perhaps than anyone else, historian Eric Foner has brought the truth about Reconstruction to light. We visited the newly dedicated Reconstruction-era National Monument in Beaufort, South Carolina.
This area was almost like a test case. Could these former slaves really be free people? Could they learn? Could they work as free people? Not everybody knew what the answer was going to be, but they proved themselves in Beaufort, and it actually therefore had an impact on Reconstruction as it developed.
You've written what many of us think is the Bible on Reconstruction. We've written 10 books on Reconstruction. You're going to write an 11th on the Reconstruction amendments. To what do we attribute your fascination?
You know, the ferment at the local level in Reconstruction, which really I think is a big story, how the end of slavery upends everything. And a new system has to be created, a new economic system, a new political system, a new legal system. You know, slavery was a total institution, and that's gone. You've got to build a new society.
And one of the barriers, of course, was the tremendous legacy of anti-black racism.
Absolutely. You're absolutely right. Racism, which is the deepest legacy of slavery, really, in our society, you know, it would be nice, but one can't very well expect that the legacy of racism would just be sloughed off because slavery ended. Didn't happen, and that was a tremendous barrier to change.
In 1866, a Richmond journalist published a book called The Lost Cause. He argued that the war was, in reality, a gracious Southern civilization defending itself against Northern aggression, an idea that resonated deeply among the defeated white Southerners.
One has to remember that the white South suffered a devastating loss of life in the Civil War, something really without parallel in American history.
The South is devastated. People are literally starving. They had destroyed their economy. They had torn their families apart. It was hard to see any real meaning in what the Confederacy had done. I think people wanted to find something to hang on to.
Many former Confederates stubbornly clung to the belief that their cause had been just.
That whole lost cause myth developed out of the idea that the only reason why they were fighting at all was because the North was trying to suppress their rights. For the Confederacy, the war was absolutely about slavery. First, last, middle. All we have to do is look at the ordinances of secession, the debates in the various state legislatures, private letters, they're all talking about slavery as the cornerstone of their civilization.
The Confederate Constitution was very, very clear in terms of the role of slavery in its society. Number one, that it shall in fact be perpetual. And number two, if the nation expands, slavery goes with it.
Looking back almost a century later, the Southern writer noted only at the moment when Lee handed Grant his sword was the Confederacy born.
One of the things that's often forgotten is that many white Southerners did not want to fight for the Confederacy, had never supported secession in the first place. But with the end of the war, it becomes possible to imagine a kind of unified Confederacy as it recedes.
The Confederacy in many ways has had far more of an active life after Appomattox than it did before. After Appomattox, it was just a fantasy. It was a dream of what that nation could have been.
Some people cope with defeat.
I think going back in time, there was like Lincoln, Andrew Jackson. Wasn't Confederacy way before that? Because if they brought up like that Bill of Attainder, North Carolina law, those are all like 1700s.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, all this they're talking about Andrew Jackson, Lincoln, that's 1800s.
Yeah.
So if they're going back in time and pretending that that's something new they created during the 1800s, during emancipation, when they took it from, you know, quote unquote, like families owning slaves to the federal government owning the slaves now. So is that what's happening? Are they trying to put the Confederacy in a different timeline?
Well, I think the reason why it would appear like that again is because of all the colorable language in there. So
they have to tie it in terms of everything has to be confusing because they're using language that's not fitting. You're talking about people and things that don't exist, right? So then that sort of tie, from my perspective, I think that's what we were saying. It's sort of making it seem like it's all split up, but they're sort of having
a new creation.
Yeah, it's the reconstructing of the actual,
when they're talking about Reconstruction America after the Civil War, but the documentary itself is a reconstruction.
Islam.
You know what I mean? Like they're reconstructing, yeah, like straight Inception. You know what I mean? Because they could just tell, you know, certain parts they could just say how it is so that you don't have that you know, like where you going with certain things that you're bringing up. You know what I mean? Because yeah, like you're saying, all the things that they're talking about is Constitution 1700s, but this is talking about after Lincoln or whatever. He's talking about 1890s, going into 1900s, right before even with Drew Ali presenting certain things. You know what I mean? Which would clear up everything as well. You know, because of the status, the status thing that even this is based in. What's the status of these people that we just freed from slavery? Like, what status are we putting them in? Are we going to put them as citizens? Well, we can't do that because you have to be European, because you can't be part of our stuff. All right, but then we're going to make them, you know, what are we going to do with these people?
Well, they start making them, as you were saying, they start making them a product of the state, which takes the responsibility from the actual sort of, you know what I mean, the individual, and puts it onto the corpse again, right? And then you just keep going, and that's where the matrix comes into. You just keep producing the next level of biological worker, right? And now we're at the cusp now where they're trying to make these automated workers really work for us, and that's the threat. And really what I realized, I was thinking about this a couple of days ago, you can't replace us with robots, and that would destroy the whole system. The whole system is really about us working for them. Right? That's the whole system. They're convincing you that somehow you got to be afraid that some robot's going to take some shit over. Right? That's the fear for you to keep working. Fuck it, get some robots doing some work. Really relax. That shit's happening.
My opinion is like.
Yeah. Let E or what Evo do a 12-hour shift. What are you talking about?
No, but like.
Don't make that house.
With the whole collapse of the economy and everything, right? Like when they do that, because of the 2020, they have initiatives, right? All the corporations have agreements to become green, and otherwise they have to pay.
So the whole deal is to try and remember, this is some of the stuff too with the economics part. What they have to do is they have to release the steam, right? The steam is they have to get rid of some money. Some money's gotta disappear. That's why you're gonna have to have another, like you say, a war or some shit where the books just get canceled out.
Yeah.
All this money went there. There was no
Yeah.
money to begin with.
Yeah.
Corporations are all illusions. It's
Yeah.
us doing the work.
Exactly.
And we're having some barter system that we believe is what makes stuff work, whether it's the card that they've moved us to. They can't get rid of the bill yet. They're trying hard,
Yeah.
right? But the bill means everything too, right? Because once we start figuring out that it's us, it's over for them too, right? They gotta keep that little fine line. You still gotta get some paper check, some little bill to pretend some shit's worthwhile, right? While they're figuring out the next steps. It's really, this is what I realized too, and as it goes on, it talks about it. This is what the prophet warned us about too. It's really about our media. It's really about when we go home, do we turn on that TV and get plugged back into this nonsense? Right? Because this is all a spell right here.
But they've been putting their debt on us, right? So all the whole collapse of the economy and there being a deficit and all of that, like that's all theirs, and they're just trying to push it on us. When in reality, because countries like Venezuela and other countries are nationalizing and everything, like, you know.
Yeah, but the problem is on that national level, everyone has sort of, that's what the prophet makes a light of too, is that everyone has dipped into that game. Everyone's dipped into the game, so no one's hands are clean. The problem is, how do we get out of this? The problem for us too is that we're immersed in it, in the one spot, that we're not going to get any amount of the truth. The Kiva was talking about, you just got to go somewhere else on this planet, outside of this North America spot here, on this, and you're going to be treated like an individual, like a Moor. What he was telling me, right? So, and I remember that when I went to Scotia, at Africville. I remember that was one of the first times I felt like I was at peace.
Nova Scotia?
Yeah, Nova Scotia. I was saying that was that was our stuff over there too. It was all our stuff. All right, that's the problem. But we keep watching stuff as if it's not our stuff. Then we can't convince people to come here because people every day want to go and get some Jordans or do whatever.
That's where
Right?
the slaves went.
It's not.
That's where the slaves went when they got free.
Well, that's what you're saying. But I think that's what the slaves were. I think that's.
Exactly.
I mean, watch this. Let's be honest. That was probably more, yet again, a Reconstruction to say that that's where they landed. How's it all the slaves are right there? How did we get all here? None of it makes sense when you start breaking it down. How did we get all those people here? Where are they? Right?
A nation.
And then you start tracing back, and Granny was here, and then you start finding some people have lines where the line goes back before the ship was here. Right? And then you start finding all the artifacts. And then you start finding all the artifacts that were here before they came here.
Before it gets shipped to the Smithsonian.
Oh, Mocha could attest to that, or tell us, right?
Are you trying to say I've been around that long?
You're a spring chicken. Anyways, yeah, so but there's some deep stuff coming up with some of the, and this is some of the stuff I want you to focus on.
Yeah, maybe like, the little bit that we went through was just the, you know what I mean? Like, maybe I think like 30.
It's coming up right here, right now.
40 minutes
It's
or
touched on
whatever.
it right now when we start getting into the literature, and this is the stuff that we gotta look at, changing our mental.
By mythologizing slavery, others tried to recreate it. In November of 1865, the government that Andrew Johnson had set up in Mississippi passed a set of oppressive laws that applied only to African Americans. Soon, other southern states followed suit. These laws became known as the Black Codes.
The basic purpose of the Black Codes was to recognize that slavery has been abolished, but to make sure that there is as little change from slavery to freedom as possible.
The key to the Black Codes was what they called vagrancy laws, things like that. Every adult black person was required to sign a labor contract for the year with a white employer. If they didn't do that, they would be considered a vagrant, and they could be fined, and if they couldn't pay the fine, they could be auctioned off to someone who would pay the fine, and then they'd have to work off the fine for that person.
Crazy.
That's like crazy congo, right? Crazy congo.
A labor contract for the year with a white employer. If they didn't do that, they would be considered a vagrant, and they could be fined, and if they couldn't pay the fine, they could be auctioned off to someone who would pay the fine, and then they'd have to work off the fine.
Right, so then that law so lets you know that they weren't free. So they tell them that they're free men or whatever like that, but you could get auctioned off for a fine. If you're getting auctioned off, obviously you're property. if they can auction you off.
So being a vagrant was a criminal charge at the time.
Yeah.
Which means you go to jail.
So it's the same like now. Like when you become a criminal or whatever, you lose your rights and this and make you work in jail. So like it's like jaywalking, you're a criminal, go to jail.
But jail was go work for somebody, not go behind the
outside jail.
Yeah.
But now look at for now in the city, garnish someone's mouth, garnish their face. Means like not garnish is paying that debt that you did.
Yeah.
So it's the same thing. You're like working for free for somebody now.
Yeah.
Like what
Yeah.
pay that debt.
That type of psychology work is worse than like, cause you're saying outside jail, but you being outside and knowing like every day you're gonna be like, I could get away with that. Every day. It's like a way that you want to get away.
You're outside.
And that, you know what type of,
can't
that's
get
gonna
out.
kill your mental psyche.
Can't get out.
Yeah, you know you're behind certain walls and you can't go nowhere, you have to just do it and accept it.
Yeah.
But now it's like, yo, shit, did I miss my opportunity? Like, I could have went just now? Should I went the next minute? Like,
actually locked up.
everything. Huh?
That's not the same as this place.
Of course it's outside. And all the times the reason with my virgin yesterday, and there was someone who, you know, me and him has done time or whatever, we're talking about the psychology of inside and outside or whatever. I'm like, yeah, I go, all here is, it's me and you, Omar, right? All here is more dangerous. It's all here that's freaking harder. When you get in there, you're conscious. Because you could separate yourself and put yourself in a mode where it's like, you're building up yourself and you could just actually be to yourself to a certain degree, you know what I mean? And a lot of the pressures and responsibility, all those things are gone. Like, you just really gotta take care of yourself every day, don't worry about nothing, just getting up and go to sleep. You gotta take care of it, so you have time to build your mind. All here is madness, bro.
That's when we were talking more about the structures behind life in general and stuff in terms of like work and all the nuances that you have to go through. Whereas, you know, when you're in a structured institution, a lot of that stuff has really already been instituted. So it's just about you getting into it. And once you're in it, it's like getting in the fast lane. You know, everyone's moving fast, right? It's when you start getting into the fast and the slow lanes, and the next lane next to the fast lane is the slow lane. That's what we were saying, that it's much more difficult out here from a certain perspective in terms of the routine-based
Micro and macro, you know?
Foods, you know, sleep, laundry, lights, electricity, you know, all that little stuff. But anyway.
And for that person.
Notice how sometimes an
Worse
intergender person that
than
looks
being
European.
arrested if you don't have a job is having your children taken away. So your neighbor down the road can go to the courts and say, John Jones, you know, he can't take care of his children. He's indigent. Well, I'll take them in. And I'll train them in farming methods. So I'll train the daughters in housewifery. And I'll have their labor, and the parents will get a little bit of money at the end of their
Another thing
period.
that's kind of wild is we've seen all the pictures of our people in the, I don't know, like from back in those days, it's sort of, and they weren't all in sort of depicted negatively. So I felt there was a lot of energy that came off of that.
Yeah.
See it come off of that. Sorry.
But black parents didn't have a say in this.
A lot of parents are fighting back and saying, no, they don't want their children to be apprenticed. They can take care of them. They also know that in apprenticeship conditions, they can't protect their children from physical and sexual abuse. It becomes a way for the planter class to continue stealing the labor of the children and sometimes stealing the children themselves.
Enforcement of the Black Codes went hand in hand with relentless violence against the freed people.
Outside of cities and towns, the Union Army was shrinking rather than expanding. You're looking at former slaveholders who can't imagine living in a world where slavery doesn't exist if the Union Army is not on the ground and the Freedmen's Bureau is not there to enforce the new rules. then they were going to do whatever they could to keep the African American population in a state of subordination.
The Ku Klux Klan is created in Tennessee in 1866. It coincides with the creation of black codes. You could argue that on some levels that the Klan was doing the same thing that the slave patrols did. During slavery, the slave patrols would make sure people have passes, making sure that they are not loitering, they're not getting together in bands of people, and the Klan is going to do the same type of thing.
You have people who are targeted because they've managed to acquire a decent amount of land, or their children are in school, and a white person in their community is struggling at the same time. What they decide is that the way to deal with this is to attack the person, to take away everything they have, to destroy their property, to run them off their land.
At war's end, Frederick Douglass had wondered what new form slavery might take. After 6 months of Andrew Johnson's Reconstruction, the answer was painfully obvious. Thaddeus Stevens, the passionately impatient Republican congressman, had been forced to wait on the sidelines for months, watching powerlessly as Andrew Johnson raced to implement his version of Reconstruction before Congress reconvened. The president declared that the former Confederate states had met his terms, so their representatives were in Washington, ready to take their seats in Congress as members of the Union once again. Stevens thought this was outrageous.
When the states met to elect new congressional delegations, they elected to Congress the Vice President of the Confederacy, 4 Confederate generals, 6 members of the Confederate cabinet, many Confederate congressmen.
It is, by its very nature, defiant for Southern white former Confederate officers to head to Congress right after the war. On the other hand, they never believed the war was about fundamentally restructuring their economic and political hierarchy. The idea that if you served or if you had slaves at one point, that now you are politically disenfranchised never was in the kind of Southern white imagination during that period of time.
Once the Southern delegates were seated in Congress, they'd represent their home states back in the Union again.
Either they were going to be admitted, and that was going to be the end, and Reconstruction would have been over at that point, or they weren't.
As a leader of the House Republicans, Stevens found the prospect appalling.
Thaddeus Stevens would say, African American men helped save the United States. We have a moral obligation to create a foundation of freedom and equality before the law, and without that, anything else is going to be a fraud. He was fired with this passion for justice that would saturate the entire social order. He was ready for a revolution in the South.
Stevens and his fellow House Republicans had planned for this moment. At the stroke of noon, when the 39th Congress opened, they set those plans in motion.
The clerk began to read the roll of the members of Congress, and he skipped over the representatives from the southern states.
As it becomes clear that they're not going to call upon any rebel state congressman, Democrats start to jump up and to scream, "This is revolution." In fact, they were right. It was a revolution.
Each House of Congress has the power to exclude those it finds unfit. If the clerk fails to call your name, you're not a member of Congress. Not a single name from the rebel states did the clerk call that day.
That's their in-fight. The European little in-fight that they got their little stuff that has nothing to do with us. Only if we're in the property story with them. If there's no Negro, black, colored, then that infighting is for them to deal with. They're only having this infighting because of the whole quote-unquote slavery idea. Because the North is saying, well, we're not really with that or whatever. Meanwhile, all them, they got slaves or whatever at home. And then the South is like, well, what do you mean? How can you not be down with it? You know what I mean? Because we know that that's what's up. If we're going to get anywhere around here, who's going to build the stuff up that we need done? We're not going to do it for ourselves. You know?
But I think wasn't sort of the unique part of that was that in the South, the cotton industry, which took a lot of manual labor, was something that they were looking, and that's where in the South, having the numbers of manual labor was what was needed. Whereas in the North, in the industrial, it was a little bit more specified, right? From my perspective.
Isn't that when they changed it to hemp though?
The what?
It's now they changed it to hemp.
Well, no, I mean, I'm not saying that I know enough about it. All I'm saying is the cotton industry to me was what I think a big part of that whole thing in the South was all about, right? About those free workers that they have, right? And the North sort of changing to a more of an industrial, guys working the fire, in the factories, and I think this is where the whole work contract thing came in, which is where we were going to house the slaves. You're still not making anything, but you felt like you were making something, right? And this is what this is all talking about.
When was George Washington president? When George Washington was president?
He held office starting 1791.
Because wasn't that him? He made everybody grow hemp for the war, so that they could have the hemp for the ropes, the clothes, everything. It became mandatory.
But what you were talking about in terms of registering all that stuff, that was after the coup d'etat, 1861, right? This is like 1866 during Andrew Jackson, when they introduced the Black Codes, the Christian Black Code from Pope Pius IV, the Amendment 14, nothing being ratified because, again, the coup d'etat. And when Andrew Jackson said, like if somebody has, $20,000, come see me so you can get that, that was them registering from their private business to the public domain that belongs to the Pope. Right? That was that transition. That was like, okay, let's start creating a database for our European guys to. That's the transition from private ownership to federal.
Everything they do is
No, it's forced to because they were in charge.
They would have forced it, yeah, because they have like slave refugee acts and all this other stuff to do their inquisition.
And also, when did Eli Whitney apparently invent the cotton gin? So that would have taken away the need for a lot of the labor as well, because of this machine that can do it, didn't have to be fed or anything else.
Congress was boldly seizing control of Reconstruction.
Some Democrats say the American Republic died on December 4th, 1865, and in some ways they might be right. But a second American Republic is born over the next 5 years that has a different constitution. One that's going to be written painfully and slowly and imperfectly, but written by Stevens and his colleagues in Congress.
This Republican-dominated Congress turned its attention to a pioneering Civil Rights Act, which they passed over President Johnson's veto in April 1866.
And also to remember that when they were talking about the whole right to vote, and then the Asiatics supposed to be voting Republican, which they vote Democrat today. Right? Because the Republicans really then, as the Continental Congress, the ones who made sure that everything was established properly so that these Europeans who are taking it over are taking over something that they can manage, right?
Was Congress's answer, you might say, to the Black Codes and to Johnson's Reconstruction plan. It established the principle of birthright citizenship. Anyone born in a country is a citizen.
Why do they do this? Because they know that southern states are looking for ways to define ex-slaves as not citizens.
Part of what the Civil Rights Act of 1866 is doing is pushing away the prospect that people can be, as had been true for Native Americans, that people can be physically removed from
While Republicans were gaining the upper hand in Washington, a more brutal struggle was being waged throughout the South.
The white South begins to realize that there's no real possibility of fighting the North, but they can win the struggle on the ground, at home, over the people that they're really worried about.
All throughout the South, black people were on the move, leaving the countryside for the city. But as the crowding grew worse, tensions mounted.
Where do you live?
I've lived in Memphis very nearly 3 years.
How old are you?
I don't know exactly. I suppose about 24.
Were you here during the riots?
Yes, sir.
On the afternoon of May 1st, 1866, the streets of South Memphis were even busier than usual. The city was packed with free people. Memphis had been garrisoned by a black regiment, and a Freedmen's Bureau office had opened there. Late that afternoon, Lucy Tibbs heard gunfire in the distance. The city's black garrison was being demobilized, and many of the former soldiers were celebrating in the streets. Memphis was seething with racial hostility, especially between the largely Irish police force and the black garrison.
African American Civil War veterans return, not only with a kind of bearing that comes from military service, many of them are going to come back with weapons that they have purchased from the Union. They're going to march through the streets of their cities, they're going to create militias, and they will meet white Southerners for whom this is a real overturning of the old order.
There's only two that the whole let the slaves be in the army was try to get rid of them.
But they're too strong.
Right, but
Too strong.
okay, our war is over. Now all these people are on their way back now, trained and armed to these southern states that, you know, a few years ago they were hanging them from trees, lynching them, doing all types of madness. Now they got to deal with these Negro guns now. They're over.
Just to remind you too, remember, you think that there are some slaves coming back home to whatever, they're just coming home.
Yeah.
They've been fighting the so-called British to sort of, you know, keep their republic going. So that's what you're seeing. It's really the guys marching back, coming back home.
About 6 o'clock, I saw boys and men with pistols, firing at every black man they could see. They shot them down as fast as they could come to them.
How many did you see shot down?
The first was killed by General Pendergrass. He keeps a grocery by my house. I was looking right at him when he shot that man.
One of the things that I think is frightening about the violence is that many people do know the people who are perpetuating this violence against them. They can name them.
White mobs, including most of the city's police force, began to roam the streets on the hunt for black people.
At night, they barred up all the doors, then surrounded the houses and told the folks to stay in there.
Is that what they told you?
Yes, sir. Brother Man Pendergrass and his sons set them on fire. When the fire got very hot, I saw men, women, and children break out and run. They shot at them as fast as they could while they were running.
The free people are sort of beyond the law. And so there's an incredible amount of casual violence.
Did they come into your house?
Yes. I said, please don't do anything to me. I'm just here with 2 little children.
Did they do anything to you?
They done a very bad act. I just had to give up to them.
It took the army 3 days to regain control of Memphis. By that time, every black church and every black school had been burned to the ground. At least 48 people had been killed, all but 2 of them black. Not a single white person had been killed by a black person. The nation was riveted by the news out of Memphis. Then 3 months later, almost 40 more people were killed by a white mob in New Orleans.
The political consequence of this in the North was it helped to convince large numbers of Northerners that Johnson's Reconstruction plan was a failure. Andrew Johnson was not down there committing acts of violence, but this was sort of the logical outcome of Johnson's Reconstruction plan. When you say blacks really have no rights whatsoever, obviously you're encouraging an atmosphere which does not feel, to use a modern phrase, that black lives matter very much.
Lucy Tibbs was among the dozens of victims who testified to congressional investigators.
It's enormously meaningful as an act of courage to testify. They would have to worry about going home and effectively being subject to continued violence, this time perhaps even death.
The testimony of the Memphis survivors helped to convince Republicans in Congress that the rights of the formerly enslaved had to be written into the Constitution itself.
This is what inflames white Northerners so much, the widespread violence against the freed people, the massacres in New Orleans and Memphis. So Reconstruction becomes stronger because of what the white South does.
Republicans in Washington were interested in setting the nation on a new footing, and that's what they did through the 14th Amendment.
The 14th Amendment redefined the rights of the freed people, and by extension, the rights of all Americans. Anyone born in the United States would automatically be granted citizenship.
Again, which goes back to the corporate citizenship that really takes away their citizenship.
Really, the orange is a corpse, right?
And it makes them a corpse. And again, the whole idea of, people not seeing that this thing that was created for the blacks or whatever, was really for everybody to be enslaved. And remember, this is like what you're talking about after the coup, and then now they have Reconstruction, now they have a new constitution, they got all these slave clauses, amendments, black guys, whoever, free people, whatever, everybody's in on this now. It's not just limited to only the slaves being looked at or whatever. They're looking across the whole scope of everybody and putting everybody under. No, the ones who, like from the European side, those ones, they're good. They have nothing to worry about, right? The ones on our side that were free, they're Aboriginal and Indigenous. They have nothing to do with what's going on as far as all this. They have their own world that they're living in. This is strictly related to the people who are the government and their citizens. And the citizens giving up all their power to the government because they're thinking that, whether it's Democrat or Republican, they're dealing with people in their favor. But the people who are claiming that they're the government aren't even in favor of the people, if they're going to make them property too. Just like the Negroes are property. And then the people not realizing that they got made Negroes. And they're pretending like, yeah, the city of and the state of and we got addresses and birth certificates, licenses, all this stuff. When all that stuff was to sell you out. It was put you under the jurisdiction of a master, regardless who that master is or what that master is.
And no state could deny to any person due process and equal protection of the laws. Congress passed the 14th Amendment in June of 1866. It turns out that was the easy part. The real challenge lay ahead. Every southern state had an all-white government that had been created by President Johnson. And every one of those state legislatures, except for Tennessee, refused to ratify the amendment. How were Republicans in Washington going to get 3/4 of the states to ratify the 14th Amendment? The answer began to emerge almost a year later. By the spring spring of 1867, the radical Republicans were firmly in control. Every former state except Tennessee remained out of the Union, having no say in federal elections. The northern-dominated electorate had given the Republicans huge congressional majorities in the 1866 midterms. The newly empowered majority lost no time in passing sweeping new laws over President Johnson's veto. Reconstruction entered a bold new phase.
In the spring of 1867, Congress turned from kind of the more moderate measures to saying, you know, we actually have to reorganize the South and set these states on a different course. And so the way that they do that is establishing the former Confederacy in 5 military districts. Each one is going to be overseen by a U.S. general. It was something that they called military reconstruction.
They marched through the South telling local officers, we can fire you, we can overrule you. Their goal is visibility, and their goal is to make a statement, you're not in charge, Confederates, we are.
Congress laid out strict new terms. The rebel states had to adopt new constitutions, give black men the right to vote, elect new state governments, and ratify the 14th Amendment. Then, and only then, could they be readmitted to Congress.
How would you get the southern states to adopt the 14th Amendment, to which they are deeply resistant? You say black men must be able to vote, and they also must be able to hold office. This, in the white Southern imagination, is the great travesty of Reconstruction. Some of the former Confederates who had been disenfranchised after the war still cannot vote, whereas black men can. So that is what just really infuriates the white South. And they call it bayonet rule.
When Southern whites imagined what could come after the war, should they lose, it was never a possibility of like a really flipped upside down social hierarchy with equality for African Americans, because that wasn't happening anywhere in the country.
Many northern states did not allow black men to vote. And so some white conservatives felt that the provision of suffrage to African American men in the South was something between hypocrisy and punishment.
Activists and army officers spread out across the South, registering freedmen to vote. At the beginning of 1867, fewer than 1% of all black men in the United States could vote. By the end of 1867, that figure was higher than 80%. A vibrant new political culture sprang up as freed men and freed women pressed for their rightful place in the Union that they had sacrificed so much to save.
The advent of black suffrage unleashes a kind of utopian idea of change. You see it in mass meetings where people get together just to read the Constitution and debate, what is democratic government anyway? How can we create it? So it is a remarkable moment of hope and of militancy.
Black men and women, these folks who had just come out of slavery, would take off work on Saturdays and walk 25 miles to a political meeting.
The vote was considered basically owned by the collective, not just by individuals. And so women and children were actually involved in political discussions, they attended mass meetings.
In some states, there were significant pockets of poorer white farmers who actually, many of them had not been in support of the Confederacy, had not favored secession, and many of them suffered as a result of the Civil War. They were in dire economic straits. It's not that they weren't racist anymore, but they were willing to work with blacks to try to uplift poor farmers of both races via the Republican Party.
Former slaves themselves are breathing life into freedom, giving it substance, whether it's creating schools or enacting their own political organizations or reconstituting families. They are giving the nation a kind of blueprint for the challenges, but also the possibilities of Reconstruction.
Andrew Johnson played almost no part in these profound changes. Fending off impeachment consumed the last months of his presidency. Meanwhile, the new state governments in the South began ratifying the 14th Amendment. In July of 1868, it became the law of the land.
Ironically, if Reconstruction had gone more smoothly, you might not have had the 14th Amendment. If the white South had not insisted on putting exactly the same men back in power, if the white South had resisted the temptation to put in black codes that made a mockery of emancipation, if the white South had not endorsed these massacres in its major cities, it's easy to believe that there would not have been the fundamental changes in the American Constitution that we had.
No other New World slave society that emancipates slavery implements equal citizenship and equal protection under the law and suffrage for half of the former slave population within 5 years. That is truly revolutionary.
There was some degree of self-interest, frankly, in it on the part of the Republican Party. Why fight this war? And immediately allow the Southern leadership, the plantocracy, to reproduce not only a slave system, but the dominance of their party in the South. So for a time, the interests of the freedmen and the interests of the Northern-led Republican Party were in step with one another.
The 1868 presidential campaign presented voters with a stark choice. The Republican candidate, Ulysses S. Grant, had led the United States Army through victory in the post-war occupation of the South. The Democratic campaign was perhaps the most racist in U.S. history, and in parts of the South, it was supported by a wave of murder and arson. Would that campaign of violence succeed in preventing black men from voting? Tuesday, November 3rd, 1868 was an election day unlike any other. South Carolina and 7 other Confederate states had re-entered the Union in time for the election. But white gangs terrorized black voters in New Orleans, and Republicans in Georgia and Louisiana had to abandon campaign.
You see that right there? Is Louisiana a free country? Not quite.
Meaning altogether.
On the one hand, is this kind of euphoria and a sense of organization, kind of like Freedom Summer or something like that. On the other hand, a real sense of danger in a lot of places.
African Americans had to arm themselves, they had to go to the polls in large numbers. In some cases, African Americans have to gather together the night before an election. They sleep out in the woods, and they try to figure out when to go to the polls, when there'll be the fewest whites at the polls, so they'll actually be able to deposit their ballots.
Nothing could staunch the tide. Remarkably, 500,000 black men cast their votes. As a result, every southern state except Georgia and Louisiana voted for Ulysses S. Grant.
During the war, Grant had explicitly said, the only way we can win the war is with the support of blacks.
This ties into the...
And so he treats them as equal citizens, even before the 13th and 14th Amendments.
The freed people could take heart in the key role they played in electing the man who would crush the Confederacy. Even more remarkably, dozens of black men were elected to office. Many had been held as slaves just a few years before. For them, and for millions of freed people, this was the moment in the sun. The 3 years following the Civil War were among the most hopeful, momentous, and frightening in our history. In those years, a generation that had been born into slavery and fought a war to kill the institution helped reconstruct the United States so that it might live up to its ideals.
One of the things about Reconstruction that, to me, has always been so powerful is the way in which American democracy was revitalized. And it was revitalized by the incredible commitment
that former slaves and other people of African descent had to practicing democracy and the value that they held to it.
When you look at the radical, amazing changes that happened within a few years of the demise of slavery, there was a kind of irrational exuberance, or what people thought was rational exuberance at that point in time.
If you're living in this moment and you see the federal government in your community helping to hold up Black life, and that meant literal federal officials whose job it was to protect Black people. I mean, this is literally like the cavalry has come to the rescue. You see the future as limitless.
There are not many moments in recorded human history where a group that was so subordinated, so dispossessed, would within the space of a decade actually be fully integrated into the highest echelons of political society. It's almost like that decade advanced the possibilities of the freedmen 100 years.
Coming up on Reconstruction.
The future must have seemed limitless.
Historic Games.
Black people get to be judges.
They have their own businesses.
14 Black men in U.S. Congress, full citizenship.
When the Civil War began in 1861, nearly 4 million Black people were trapped in bondage for life. After the war was over and slavery abolished, Reconstruction was well underway. And although there were challenges ahead, Black people were filled with an unprecedented amount of hope. Frederick Douglass felt triumphant. The Black man, he declared, is a citizen. The Black man is enfranchised. We live in a new world. At last, he said, the Black man has a future. The 15th Amendment to the Constitution barred racial discrimination in voting. Black men took to the polls.
Then you see all of these Black people in charge. More than 1,500 Black officials move into positions of public leadership.
If you were an African American who had just been elected to the legislature, it was your time. The future must have seemed limitless.
Robert Smalls of South Carolina was one of these legislators. He had escaped slavery by boldly commandeering a Confederate ship and delivering it to the United States Navy, blockading Charleston Harbor. After the war, Smalls returned home to Beaufort and became one of the first heroes of Reconstruction.
What happened there? You jacked the ship?
Michael, tell me about your great-great-grandfather's life.
You know, society told Robert that he was less than a human being. He was a piece of chattel, that he was devoid of higher level thinking and strategy and planning. But he rejected all of that. The way that he commandeered the boat that was the vehicle of his freedom in the middle of the night, putting on the top hat and the long coat of the Confederate captain. I just admired the audacity he had to steal his freedom, to seize his freedom. He was born in a shack behind the house. He was enslaved here after the war. He comes back and he owns the place.
From being property to owning the property.
Absolutely.
He went from being enslaved to being elected as a state legislator in 6 years.
He was elected to the South Carolina House and then the South Carolina Senate before going to Washington and Congress.
That is the most remarkable slavery story I ever heard. Once he was in office, what sort of issues were important to him?
You know, he grew up with the children of his master and would see them going to school, and it just bothered him. He thirsted for education and sought through legislation to extend that to others.
Were you insufferable among your friends when you were in school? Did you say, my great-great-grandfather was famous?
No, actually quite the contrary. I grew up in the 70s in Boston. Race was a touchy issue then with busing. In April of 1976, I was 13. I
I had an opportunity to unveil the bust of Robert Smalls that's here in Beaufort. That was the first time I spoke about Robert Smalls, and I've done it hundreds and hundreds of times since. Look, this is American history. Robert's story is a metaphor for this broader movement that empowered a whole race of people.
Reconstruction is a story of great expectations, enormous strides, and wrenching retreats. Early on, in its most hopeful moments, it seemed like a revolution was taking place in the halls of Congress. Tell me about where we're standing. What would this place have been like during Reconstruction?
So this is the old hall of the House, now Statuary Hall. In the 1870s, when the African American members were here, there would have been vendors in here selling food and snacks as members traversed the north-south access from the House chamber over to the rotunda on the Senate side.
Tell me about the first black congressman.
First is Hiram Revels from Mississippi. He's elected to the U.S. Senate, and he comes in February of 1870, and he's celebrated as the 15th Amendment in flesh and blood, the symbolic triumph of Reconstruction. And then in December, we have Joseph Rainey of South Carolina, first African American in the House.
How would they have been greeted?
They didn't exactly roll out the red carpet, but the door didn't get shut either. Many of the African American members lived in the same neighborhoods that white members of Congress did. So they weren't segregated in that sense, but they oftentimes had to pay higher rent.
The black tax.
Essentially, yes. Imagine you have these two men who occupy the seats of former slaveholders, and they come to work in this magnificent Temple of Liberty, but it's a place that had also been constructed with slave labor.
This is an incredibly heady moment. How did Barack Obama become president? It's like 14 black men in U.S. Congress. There's 2 senators. Blanche G. Bruce's name is on money, signing currency in the United States.
See, all of these people served starting in the 1870s. I may be the only African American from South Carolina now, but I am the ninth. You had the Robert Smalls, the Richard King, Robert Elliott, Gerard, Rancier. So over that period of 25 years, you had real participatory democracy taking place.
The photograph of Hiram Revels.
So you gotta remember, this is the second time this is happening now. Right? The history repeating itself. That it was our government, we got us out the way, did their madness, had their war, used us in it, or whatever like that. Then we took over the thing again. Even after all that, still took it over again. Right? Where we had majority. And then this is where it goes into with Birth of a Nation and, you know, them stressing that point of these Negroes or, you know, the Europeans with blackface on, and then they're eating chicken and watermelon or whatever like that, and Negroes are mad because, oh, that's a racist movie and all that stuff, when they're giving them the goods. It's a lot more. You know, they're letting them know what's up. In blackface. That, yes, blackface is racist, but behind the racism, they're letting you know you were running the government. Your government. It's not some European government. Yeah, even if it's theirs, they can't do anything without us, because their whole mindset is we're the ones that make stuff run for them. Right? They'll say slavery. You know, we enslaved the black guy so they can whatever. No, you just knew where the power lied. Right? They knew which was the best battery to use for their stuff to work. They could use anybody. But make sure once you use the Asiatics, it's definitely gonna have a different frequency or energy behind it than just anybody else. You know what I mean? That they could pick up at that time to be in these positions. You gonna say something more?
I realize that obviously this is like a 2-part series. I didn't realize that. There's the whole first part until they put the thing on. I think that was the first part. I think this is the second part that I watched. But anyways, go ahead.
Is this a Ken Burns document?
No, it's a PBS special that was
PBS,
on.
yeah, some
And I
PBS
think I got the second part to it, but the part that you're all talking about that should be in here. It looks like it's
I
probably
think
gonna
it's
be
the
an hour,
Yeah.
probably gonna be another hour and something, so we'll have to break it up.
Yeah, so we got probably about 40 minutes or whatever, so we'll see how far.
Why don't we just get on?
Highlights this statesman who happens to be African American. Frederick Douglass recognized, camera captured the equal and essential humanity of that man or woman, black or white.
Whatever may be the prejudices of those who look upon them, they will be compelled to admit that the Mississippi senator is a man.
He is represented with the same stature as Lincoln or Stewart or Grant or any other white politician. Douglass did the same thing. At a time in which most whites tried to argue that blacks should not have equal citizenship. And one way of out-citizening white citizens is you portray yourself with greater sense of dignity and respectability, and in a sense you...
So, with them realizing, because remember, this is something they're talking about in 1800, but this was a common practice among our people who wanted to get out of slavery. If you don't want to be a slave, don't look like one. And then nobody's going to think you're a slave. Like, hey, that's a good idea or whatever. You just gotta change my shirt, that's it? And we walk off the plantation, okay, let's go. Right? Get some old shirt from slave master or whatever like that. Throw that on, walk off the plantation. Because, slaves don't look like that.
But I also want to counter too that I think that's the first layer. The second level was we weren't slaves.
Right.
So looking like that was what we naturally were anyway.
Right.
They were jacking our stuff. They're making you think that somehow we were trying to sort of recapture,
getting on their
their
shirt.
stuff. We
Yeah.
were just reclaiming our stuff.
Yeah.
So we can't forget that.
humanity than many whites.
We do not come here begging for our rights. We come here clothed in the garb of American citizenship. We come demanding our rights in the name of justice.
Richard King could capture an audience. I think all his years in the pulpit made him a really good speaker in the House. He stood up to the white supremacists who were basically calling him, inferior. And he said, look at me, I have 2 eyes, I have 2 ears, I have 2 hands, I have 2 feet. How are we different when it comes to our manhood?
I was amazed when I began to read the speeches of black congressmen in that period. I mean, here are people who are arguing about what the laws of the nation will provide in terms of human rights, and have sophisticated understanding of the underlying principles that make these freedoms necessary in a democratic society. The level of discourse was so far above the level of discourse in Congress today. It was shocking.
In state houses across the South, black men and white men were attempting to govern together for the first time. In South Carolina, where African Americans made up almost 60% of the population, voters elected a black majority House of Representatives.
It was the seat for Black Power USA. The Lieutenant Governor, Secretary of State, State Treasurer. Unimaginable, absolutely.
Many parts of the South didn't have an educated and experienced black leadership ready to step into power, which we did have in South Carolina. It had a free black group before the Civil War in Charleston, which was well educated and politically articulate.
Behind us lie 243 years of suffering, anguish, and degradation. Before us lies our mighty future. That future is ours to shape.
Robert Brown Elliott was very ambitious. He was educated as a lawyer, he had a photographic memory, he was absolutely fearless.
It's hard to imagine more daunting challenges that all of these governments have. Some parts of the South have really been devastated by war. So you've got to try to build a forward-looking government at a time where there are very few resources.
State legislatures create public schools, public hospitals, public welfare systems in a way that hadn't been seen in the South.
Black men go into these legislatures with an idea of how they're going to improve their communities. One of the most important things they do is to establish free public schools.
There were no public education systems in most of the southern states. If you had money to buy it for your children, you had it. If you didn't, well, you did without.
You start to see state constitutions adopting some policy that says education is a right. And this is providing it for all children.
Across the former Confederacy, free schools opened for both black and white children. Only a few years earlier, there were laws in the books in the South that prohibited enslaved people from learning to read and write.
Black people knew how much their freedom depended upon literacy. It was not uncommon to see 5-year-olds and 95-year-olds flocking to schoolhouses for a chance to learn how to read.
Free blacks realize white families are not going to send their kids to school with blacks. And so in every single state, you had the separate schools. And black leaders generally said that's okay. As long as black people get education, we're not going to try to force whites to go to school where they don't want to. And many black parents wanted black teachers. They didn't trust white teachers to be fair, to have the right attitudes for their children.
To meet this demand for teachers, governments, black churches, and missionary organizations established black colleges and universities. Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee was founded in 1866. Singers became the voice of Black Reconstruction. They introduced the world to the artistry of free people and to the songs of their enslaved ancestors, the spirituals.
Most white people who had ever seen blacks on stage had done so in the minstrel show.
Minstrels, white men who would paint their faces black, enlarge their lips with white makeup, and spoof the African American. America found this entertaining.
But in concert after concert, first in northern American cities and then in Europe, the singers defied expectations.
They had a decorum and dignity on stage that challenged all of the prevailing stereotypical images that white Americans had.
These are songs overcoming. They were about healing. They were about love. They're about the black struggle.
They allowed someone else to understand what it means to be in your world or in your shoes.
Using profits from performances, Fisk was able to buy the land on which it sits today. Fisk is one of the many historically black colleges and universities established during Reconstruction that are still educating students. Black people were also beginning to make inroads into other spheres of American life. They were buying land, setting up businesses, and becoming economically independent.
I started a farm.
I own one lot, 7 acres, another 1 acre, and another about 1/4 of an acre. I bought myself a little plantation. Bought another place together. That makes 98 acres.
I bought 150 acres. I have about 50 or 60 acres tended.
I rented 43 acres of land. I have a good crop there.
My husband put up an elegant blacksmith shop.
I have a son I sent to school.
It's a moment of possibility. They have reunited their families, they have formalized their unions, they have property, they have their own businesses.
The
14th Amendment and granted equal citizenship to all Americans, especially African Americans.
It was about being able to claim an American birthright, full citizenship. They saw themselves as really moving forward.
What does real equality look like? It looks like equal protection of the law.
Now, African Americans could serve as sheriffs, so they were able to go out and make arrests and bring white perpetrators in for justice.
Black people get to be judges. They get to sit on juries. They get to sign contracts in their own interest.
John Roy Lynch, a successful young businessman in Natchez, Mississippi, was appointed in 1869 as a Justice of the Peace.
He was born a slave in 1847 in Louisiana, the son of the plantation manager. And at the end of the Civil War, he attended night school.
As a very young man, he distinguished himself working in a photographer's studio.
He went to a few Republican meetings.
And impressed Adelbert Ames, who was the Reconstruction governor of Mississippi. Even though Lynch was only 21 years old, Ames appointed him to be a magistrate.
In his memoir, he wrote about how former slaves would bring all their problems to him as a local justice of the peace. There was a black man in this office. There had never been such a thing in Mississippi before the Civil War, and so former slaves kind of identified with him.
The case that came before me was that of a white man. He threatened the life of an old colored man over a business transaction. He remarked, "Do you mean that it's a crime for a white man to curse a nigger?" "Yes," the court replied. "It is as much a crime for a white man to curse a Negro as it is for a Negro to curse a white man." "Well," he exclaimed, "that's news to me."
You're living in this moment. You imagine that will only get better.
In slavery, African Americans could not control their communities. And so if people are drawing on the resources that they had developed in slavery, on their sense of what it meant to have family relationships, friendships, communities, and they're able to institutionalize them in new ways.
They create fraternal organizations like the Masons that find solidarity and strength in mutual support. It's remarkable how a whole black world of their own organizations and support structures grow up and develop.
During Reconstruction, churches became the cornerstones of the black community. Many enslaved people had been forced to worship in secret or only with the master's blessing. But now, black people were free to worship God any way they wanted. At Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston, South Carolina, the Reverend Richard Kane helped revive a congregation that had been banned under slavery. How did you first hear about your great-great-grandfather? Did your mother say, "You come from people"? That's what my mother would say. Your great-great-grandma was the greatest black preacher in history.
Yes, my mother and my great aunt, and they always talked about Richard Harvey Kane and the great work that he was able to do.
He was born free in what's now West Virginia. Was a pastor of Brooklyn in 1965. Some people would have said, "Stay in Brooklyn where it's safe."
He said that he felt like a lion bound. I mean, he wanted to be here in the South and be a missionary to the newly freed slaves.
I don't think people today understand the role of the church in the 19th century. The church was their institutional universe.
Yes, the black church was the center of everything that happened.
In 1965, some people would have said, "Stay in Brooklyn where it's safe."
He said that he felt like a lion bound. I mean, he wanted to be here in the South and be a missionary to the newly freed slaves.
I don't think people today
when we were talking about again with the labeling, she's talking about newly freed slaves now. And the whole time we were talking about these people are freedmen. So having the newly freed slave status is worse than the freeman status. Right? Which is us putting ourselves right back in it again. just like we were told that we were gonna do. That is not these Europeans or whatever that's the enemy, that's the problem. We're the ones that are the issue. Because we keep enslaving ourselves by not sticking to what it is that we know or who it is that we know that we are. Right? Always using the brand names.
Understand the role of the church in the 19th century. The church was their institutional universe.
Yes, the black church was the center of everything that happened with the community. The emotional, the educational, the political, taught the newly freed slaves that they were no longer inferior. They could accomplish anything.
And he epitomized that.
Yeah.
He was a one-man band for the black community.
Oh, yeah.
Entrepreneur, minister, editor, writer.
Yeah, congressman, state senator.
Too powerful, too influential.
Yes, yes.
Therefore dangerous.
Yes, he lived in constant fear.
One of the most tragic aspects of Reconstruction is that the more African Americans achieve, the more they put their lives at risk.
I can hear the noise of horses.
Say Ku Klux, my house.
They had on white gowns, masks on their faces.
75
They were Ku Klux.
They swore the clothes
I
off.
was blindfolded. Cut me with knives.
Whipped me.
They whipped me.
Put a rope around my neck to hang me.
Southern Democrats used violence and terror tactics to disrupt Republican control and plot their return to power. They saw themselves as the redeemers of their state.
Violence is efficient, it's easy, it's fast, and you can often do it under the cover of night. Klan attacks become so pervasive because that's how widespread the fear of black enfranchisement is.
The Klan is actually committing atrocities against everyone. They're attacking freedmen and white Southerners who were sympathetic to the Union cause and to the Republican Party.
To their eyes, emancipation was wrong. They are washing the South with blood to redeem it.
This isn't simply a question of trying to return to an earlier way of life. This is actually a political counter-revolution.
To document the violence, Congress in 1871 launched one of the most extensive investigations in our history, known as the Ku Klux Klan hearings. The United States never had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission after slavery ended. The Klan hearings were as close as we came. It was extraordinary. Congress was actually listening to black people, testifying about the atrocities committed against them.
I was elected to the legislature. They offered me $2,500 cash if I would let another man go to the legislature in my place. I told him I would not go back on my people.
That's a lot of money.
65 came to my house. My little daughter came out and begged me to carry me away. They drew up a gun and threatened me. I may say that they hit their 5,000 blows. Some of them are the first-class men in our town. One is a lawyer, one a doctor, and some a farmer. My little daughter never got over it until she died. I have never got over it yet. It broke something inside of me.
The hearings are open and public.
Women showed up at those hearings, and it took a lot of courage for them. They could face retaliations by the KKK.
But they want the world to know what had been done to them.
All the time I was planting my crop, they worried me about if they ever saw me, they would hurt me.
Whites are really attacking Hannah and her family because they have been too successful. It's jealousy. It flies in the face of the idea that blacks are inferior.
5 men bulged right against the door. George McCrae catch the little child by the foot and slipped it out of my arms. He carried me to a house, tied my hands there, pulled off all my limbs. They said, "Goddamn, you are living on an other man's premises." I said, "No, I'm living on my own premises. I gave 150 for it. They whipped me from the crown of my head to the soles of my feet. Every time they would go off, George McCrae would get his knee between my legs. Say, "Old lady, if you don't let me have to do with you, I will kill you." He said, "God damn you, I'm gonna kill you."
There are 8,000 pages of testimony given by everyday Americans. This is a haunting tale of American history and something that we don't talk about enough. Violence has always been and goes side by side in American history to the creation of a white supremacist racial ideology that has driven us from slavery all the way to the present day.
The Union war hero, Ulysses S. Grant, had run for president under the slogan, "Let us have peace." But as reports poured in from the former Confederate states, it was becoming painfully obvious that the terror was not going to stop.
Grant didn't start out as a hero in terms of race relations. At first he was very dubious about the fighting abilities of blacks, but he ended up becoming one of the greatest champions of recruiting and arming and equipping black soldiers. He had a remarkable record in terms of integrating blacks into the federal government.
Grant's reaction to planned violence is a strenuous one. He makes it clear to the Speaker of the House that Congress is going to have to address the situation.
Grant was in step with a Congress that was determined to take action.
Congressman Rainey, when he was arguing for protection against the Klan, said that when he and other black congressmen left the seat of government to return home, they were at risk.
There were a couple of instances where he and others were physically confronted on the road. Only the intervention of federal troops kept things from taking a dire turn. He had absolutely no patience listening to anyone say that maybe the Klan didn't really exist, maybe it wasn't such a big problem. Ray would say, "Oh, I just saw them a couple of days ago. What are you talking about?" And then go on to deliver a very convincing lecture.
Saying that that violence was treasonous and the federal government had an obligation to do something about it.
Congress passed a series of enforcement acts to address the crisis, the third of which is known as the Ku Klux Klan Act.
All of which together were intended to put weapons into the hands of the federal government to directly intervene.
The 14th Amendment established that states could not deprive people of privileges and immunities of citizenship or of due process of law or equal protection of law.
So what Congress is doing in the Enforcement Act, right, is trying to create a new category of offense using the 14th Amendment to, in essence, get around the fact that Southern courts are not going to convict white Southerners.
Most importantly, the federal government can suppress habeas corpus. Where violence occurred, they can hold individuals for a crime without being charged for that crime, and they can also use the militia or the military to go in and suppress violence.
To spearhead the operation, Grant appointed Amos T. Ackerman as Attorney General of the newly created United States Department of Justice, established in the executive branch in 1870.
He supervises the deployment of federal troops to restrain violence.
Many of the Klan members that believe that they're going to be charged by the federal government begin to run away and hide.
Here's the federal government finally taking the situation with the Ku Klux Klan in hand and directly striking back at it. The difficulty was going to turn out to be persistence.
The federal government could try to contain the violence, but it couldn't contain the spread of white supremacist ideology, manifesting itself in full force.
Southern oligarchs who have held power in the pre-Civil War South for decades did not want to surrender that power.
White supremacy an alliance between white people against black people was always an important device that held Southern politics together.
Southern white elites knew how to activate that bond of whiteness with poor Southern whites.
And that was difficult work to do. A lot of propaganda had to go into that.
Planters in the Democratic Party have to sell white supremacy to other white Southerners who might not have the same or even any significant economic stake in white supremacy. That planters play upon racial economic rivalry. The idea that any gain by any black man deprives all white men. But they're creating a racial zero-sum fight for economic power, for government, for jobs. They're promising a psychological benefit, a psychological wage of whiteness.
In 1870, when former Confederate General Robert E. Lee died, many white Southerners poured out their grief and sorrow for their fallen hero, a symbol of their so-called lost cause. It seemed that the longer Reconstruction continued, the more the former Confederates lamented the loss of their way of life. Robert E. Lee's death became a symbolic focal point for a wrenching outpouring of nostalgia and grief.
When he died, it's like a king has died.
Bells ring throughout the South.
Schools closed.
People closed their stores.
They wore sashes and put things on their doors to commemorate his passing.
Newspapers border their entire pages with black.
They mourn him as if this is the second time they had lost the war.
In the eyes of the white South, here was a man who embodied the things that they admired the most. Manly courage, Christian virtue, devotion to those underneath him, like the soldiers, and a kind of apparent paternalism toward enslaved people. And not only was Lee this perfect person, but he had been the perfect warrior. He had outsmarted the Yankees, but he was always up against larger forces. He helped create that myth, the Appomattox, that we have succumbed in the face of greater might. Our cause was not unjust, it just happened to have lost. It became a lost cause.
When great leaders die, or good persons die that people think of as great leaders, people are guided by emotion. As a consequence, you had this cult of Robert E. Lee developing.
And in fact, the cult of Lee had become so powerful by the 1870s that Frederick Douglass remarked that you could not pick up a newspaper nowadays without reading the most nauseating flatteries about Robert E. Lee.
The ostentatious and noisy exhibitions of sympathy and grief on the part of the rebel democracy all over the South for the man who made such Herculean efforts to destroy the government is a most painful proof that the great body of the Southern white people are far more ready to weep for the loss of a Confederate general than to sustain the government under which they live.
So it was recognized, if you rewrite the story of the war, that can have profound implications for race relations. The symbolism of Lee could become very dangerous.
The clock was ticking on Reconstruction, and the presidential race of 1872 was a test of its popularity. With black voters solidly in his corner, President Grant easily won re-election. Campaign revealed growing fault lines in the Republican Party.
Grant faced a renegade liberal Republican movement that was critical of the mainstream of the Republican Party.
There are good government types who are very upset by the scandals that have been exposed in the Grant administration.
USWA was basically a phony company that was set up to provide financing for the Pacific Railroad project, and it laundered money. It made lots of money for corrupt individuals. The difficulty is that those corrupt individuals were often members of Congress.
Grant is personally quite honest, but he seemed blind, prejudiced, almost childlike to the presence of unscrupulous people.
Corruption is as American as apple pie, and if we find it in the Grant administration and the Reconstruction South, that's not because Reconstruction was inherently corrupt. It's because corruption happens. You could almost make a bumper sticker out of it.
Liberal Republicans are also adopting more of a states' rights position now. We can't just keep intervening in the South, and nominated their own candidate for president, Horace Greeley, the editor of the New York Tribune and long-standing anti-slavery advocate.
Really made this famous statement that he's confident that masses of our citizens, North and South, are eager to clasp hands across the bloody chasm that divides them.
The split in the Republican Party is the harbinger of a retreat from Reconstruction.
Support for Reconstruction was waning in the North, where many had grown weary from the growing cost of peace. In this environment, black legislators became targets of scorn, ridicule, and anti-black racist propaganda.
Derogatory images of African Americans become more and more prominent in the 1870s.
Even someone like Thomas Nast, who was a very vocal advocate for African American political rights during Reconstruction, used his artistry with Harper's Weekly to depict the African Americans in South Carolina, for example, where they have a black majority, in the most vile ways.
James Pike, a Republican, works on the New York Tribune, publishes this book called The Prostrate State. South Carolina is under the rule of barbarism, incompetence.
He has a famous passage in which he's describing really buffoons. Those who are not buffoons are corrupt or incompetent.
He hammers again and again and again on almost animalistic stereotypes of field workers to say, really? Are these the people you want to have in charge of your government? Passing laws that suck tax dollars out of hardworking Americans? No. And in fact, we're pretty sure they shouldn't be parts of polite American society at all.
They perpetuate an idea that Reconstruction has effectively failed and that the federal government and the Republican Party needed to cut its losses and remove itself from the South. Leave the Negro to those who know him best. White Southerners.
As enthusiasm for Reconstruction dwindled in the North, Democrats felt emboldened to intensify their counter-revolution throughout the South. Year after year, election after election, they would not relent. In 1873, amidst the fallout from a fiercely contested election in Louisiana, black Republicans in the town of Colfax staged an armed occupation of the courthouse to prevent Democrats from taking over the Perry seat.
White paramilitary organizations surround the courthouse with artillery.
The white vigilantes offered guarantees of safe conduct. If you will come out, if you will surrender yourselves, the white vigilantes line them up and execute them. It's nothing more than pure, unadulterated murder. The United States Attorney in Louisiana, under the Enforcement Act, is responsible for the arrest of over 100 of the white vigilantes. However, Louisiana juries turned out to be extraordinarily reluctant to convict. Only 3 convictions are obtained.
White Southerners made it difficult for the Republicans and Northerners to enforce Reconstruction policy. The organized white supremacist groups were trying to make the cost of federal intervention higher than the federal government was willing to bear.
Increasingly organized societies, paramilitary clubs, white leagues claimed control of public places.
John Roy Lynch, now a congressman, was targeted when he returned home to Mississippi to campaign.
At Fayette, they paraded the streets, yelled, fired cannon. Each club had a wagon with fodder. Colored men said these wagons contained guns. Democrats all gathered around the place. I took a stand. They commenced to yell at the top of their voices so as to drown out every word I attempted to utter.
Southern whites were attempting to take the South back, the red shirts and the Knights of the White Camellia. That's essentially what the so-called redemption movements were.
They're the ones who are defending the right order of things in civilization, that white people control black people. And that's the way it should be.
The brutal violence was accompanied by a major economic downturn, the first since the end of the war. It was known as the Panic. Banks and railroads were at the center of the storm, but soon it spread to every corner of the economy.
The Panic of 1873 has enormously destructive influences through the economy, north and south. A really devastating impact is political.
Northern Republicans lose election after election in the midterms of 1874 to Democrats who promised first to save the economy, but also to end Reconstruction in the South.
Democrats achieve a majority in the House of Representatives for the first time since the Civil War.
Democrats also gained control of state governments in Alabama, Texas, and Arkansas. Reconstruction's future was perilous. But the fight wasn't over. In 1874, congressional districts with majority black populations elected leaders like Robert Smalls and John Lynch. They would face stiff opposition as members of the minority party.
The Democratic majority in the House of Representatives means no more money for Reconstruction initiatives. So, if there will be political troubles around election time, if the Ku Klux Klan will suddenly reawaken and begin intimidating voters at the polls, murdering black people on the roads, night riding to terrorize blacks into submission, there would be no initiative coming out of Washington.
Was there a sense of desperation because of the reversal of the 1874 election?
What had been a 100-seat majority for Republicans turned into roughly an 80-seat majority for Democrats. Coming into the new Congress, he had a long lame duck session of about 3 months. The clock is ticking. African Americans know that this is really probably going to be the last shot at a far-reaching civil rights bill.
It prohibited discrimination in public transportation, juries, public accommodations such as hotels, and public education. Immediately when the Civil Rights Bill came to the floor, Southern Democrats and Northern Democrats alike railed against the bill. They believed that it was unconstitutional. Opponents of the bill thought the U.S. government had no business telling the proprietors of restaurants or the people who run railroads who they could admit. These are private businesses and they can decide who their clientele is.
The critics believed that it was not about non-discrimination. They saw it as about social equality. And their view is that social equality could not be legislated. It couldn't be enforced. It shouldn't be imposed.
This is pushing integration that is unnatural. You're going to force a white person to ride next to a black person. The next thing you know, you're going to force a white person to have a black person over for dinner or interracial marriage.
They were apoplectic about the idea that they had to protect their whiteness and in particular protect their white women against this exposure to African Americans.
Near the end of the first full day of debate, most members were given 20 minutes each to speak. And Alexander Stephens of Georgia, or former Confederate vice president stood up feebly because he was confined to a wheelchair and requested a full hour to speak. And Republican leadership agreed as long as Robert Brown Elliott also had a full hour to provide his rebuttal. Stevens, leaning precariously on a big stack of papers, gives this long, monotone, prepared speech in which he goes over the unconstitutional arguments for the Civil Rights Bill. When he sits down, it's late. George Hoare of Massachusetts says, well, you know what, maybe we won't have Elliott speak today. Maybe he can go first thing tomorrow. And that may have been strategic, because word got out that Robert Elliott was going to provide a rebuttal to the former vice president of the Confederacy. The next day when Elliott takes the floor, the galleries are packed with African American observers. Reporters had shown up, and the whole chamber is just filled with people. Elliott gives this really booming delivery.
The Constitution of a free government ought always be construed in favor of human rights. I cannot and I will not forget that the welfare and rights of my whole race in this country are involved.
10 minutes.
The race whom he spurned and trampled on are here to meet him in debate and to demand the rights which are enjoyed by their former oppressors.
When Elliott finishes, the whole room erupts into booming applause. People line up to shake his hand. This is a real symbolic moment. The old planter class appears feeble and on its way out, and this dark-skinned, suave, intelligent African-American man represented the way forward.
Congress passed the Civil Rights Act, but there was a clause that was stripped from the final act, and that was about education. Americans were not ready for that kind of equality in education yet, and apparently wouldn't be for many, many more years.
While Congress managed to get the Civil Rights Act of 1875 across the finish line, another branch of government blunted the reach of the 14th Amendment. In 1876, the Supreme Court announced its ruling in United States versus Cruikshank, the appeal of the 3 white men convicted of murdering African Americans guarding the courthouse in Colfax, Louisiana.
The decision which is handed down in Cruikshank is one of the most remarkably feeble-minded and disastrous decisions that the United States Supreme Court has ever handed down. And the reasoning ran like this. The 14th Amendment was only intended to restrain states from depriving U.S. citizens of the privileges and immunities that they're supposed to enjoy. But what went on in the Colfax Massacre, first of all, was not a state action. It was not the state of Louisiana. But this was, in fact, merely individuals.
It was a local crime. Private violence is the business of the state. And if they are not taking care of it, that's just too bad.
Mobs of whites decide to kill you. Have you been denied your right? Well, the Supreme Court decided that you've not been denied your right if you were murdered, as long as it's just private individuals, whether individually or collectively, that are interfering with your rights. That's not a federal case.
While the Cruikshank decision didn't close the door on possible future prosecutions, it narrowed the pathways for enforcing the 14th Amendment.
But it stood between the Redeemers and their ultimate goal, which was terrorize African Americans so completely that across the South, hundreds of thousands who had been registered and had been politically active would be reduced to a few hundreds in many of the jurisdictions that they once actually dominated.
Grant saw that support for Reconstruction was eroding, so he decided to pull back on military interventions in the South to enhance his party's chances in the North. With the next presidential election months away, Washingtonians, black and white, came together to honor a past president, Abraham Lincoln. For one man, the occasion afforded an unprecedented national platform for a call to action.
On April 14, 1876, this plaza near Capitol Hill was teeming with people, including members of both houses of Congress, the Supreme Court justices, and the President of the United States, Ulysses S. Grant. The crowd had gathered here on the 11th anniversary of Lincoln's assassination to witness the unveiling of this monument honoring his crowning achievement, the Emancipation Proclamation.
The most memorable words spoken that day were those of Frederick Douglass.
Truth compels me to admit even here in the presence of the monument, Abraham Lincoln was not our man. He was preeminently the white man's president. You are the children of Abraham Lincoln. We are best his stepchildren. To you, it especially belongs to preserve and perpetuate his memory and commend his example.
When he says Abraham Lincoln was a white man's president, you go, whoa, that is an amazing thing to say in front of the most powerful politician in the Republic in the year 1876. It's shocking.
Yeah, it's presidential election year. It appears that Reconstruction is unraveling. He used this opportunity to make a speech about the responsibility of the U.S. government, which was sitting right in front of him, to hold together whatever was left of Reconstruction if they could.
There's this understanding in 1876 that blacks have all the rights now that they should expect. We have the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. The Republican Party, it's become a party of large financiers, corporate men, and captains of industry. Now let's focus on the economy.
When Republicans cast for a likely candidate, Rutherford B. Hayes seems to be the man. He finished the war as a Union general. But by the time he becomes governor of Ohio, he has begun to pull back on black equality. He's untainted by corruption, which will be extremely valuable because Senator Tilden is running almost entirely on an anti-corruption platform as a Democrat. But Hayes is also bland enough that he will offer no objection to anyone. He is a first-rate, second-rate man.
Both candidates pledged that they would bring Reconstruction to an end.
Election night is complete and utter confusion.
Even though Tilden won the popular vote, the results from Florida, South Carolina, and Louisiana, where African Americans faced severe violent repression, were undetermined.
Republicans convinced Southern governments to declare enough votes invalid to swing the Electoral College to Hayes.
The Democrats were so outraged by the fact that Tilden was not declared the winner that they began to rally their voters under the slogan "Tilden of Blood." There were real fears of civil war. Grant started to call in troops to guard Washington. And he said, either party can afford to lose an election, but we as a people cannot afford to have a presidential election that is tainted by false or illegal results. Congress created a bipartisan commission that declared Hayes the winner by one vote.
Democrats predictably cried foul.
Hayes was referred to as rather fraud v. Hayes. He was called his fraudulency.
February, as Inauguration Day neared, the election still remained undecided. Republicans and Democrats came together and cut a deal. Hayes is inaugurated as President of the United States.
It's hard to imagine, in the moment of an election, a party trading a presidential victory unless it means protecting their way of life. White supremacy is a long-term campaign. It was more important to reinstate that power structure than it was to win the White House.
Hayes promises white Southerners that he will leave the South to conduct its own affairs unimpeded, and that the Negro problem will be its to solve.
These federal troops would stop enforcing the kinds of reforms that had marked the Reconstruction era. The southern states had been redeemed.
whoever had been elected, whether it was Hayes or Tilder, Black people were going to suffer because Northerners had decided to move on.
It was a time of so much hope, so much optimism. The horizon seemed limitless. And then, boom, came redemption.
I can only imagine it was the most frustrating thing for Robert Smalls. Here's someone who literally risked his life to be free and devoted himself to creating this new America. And to see that dismantle must have just been horrible. You know, one of his most famous quotes is, "My race needs no special defense. For the past history of them in this country proves them to be the equal of anyone, anywhere. All they need is an equal shot at the battle of life."
From the very beginning, the success of Reconstruction depended on the will of the nation to hold the line against the forces of violence eager to undo it. As the nation's will faltered, the rights of African Americans would be sacrificed to political expediency. After 12 tumultuous years, Black people faced an uncertain future. As Frederick Douglass put it, if war among the whites brought peace and liberty to blacks, what will peace among the whites bring?
Coming up on Reconstruction, it's a set of beliefs, philosophies, attitudes, race relations hit bottom.
The chip.
Shalom, Morris. I think there's one more part.
By the way, he's a teacher at school.
Part
right?
3.
So, this should be
It's a
interesting.
good one. Yeah, so.
Jason, this is the Moors. Jason.
Please, yeah. All right. Yeah, so there's one more part, so I guess we'll hit that one up next week. And if there's any input, just write down your little thoughts or whatever, and we can build on that for next Sunday. Laundry.
Yo.
You wanna just plug the
Huh?
next week?
Huh?
Next week? You wanna just plug next week? 5th, right?
Yeah.
That's next Sunday, right? Yeah.
Or you can eat. Fast on Saturday and come eat on Sunday.
Which part? What's the address of the spot again? Yeah?
Huh?
What's the address of the spot again? 388? Ellesmere?
Kennedy and Ellesmere.
Kennedy and Ellesmere Fusion, right?
Yeah.
Fusion Lounge.
There's a flyer. Didn't you just think out the flyer?
Yeah, but I wrote the flyer on me.
I'll forward it out again. What's the time for that?
11 to 2.
There's no class next week?
11 to 2. Yeah, it'll be over there. So, whatever your whatever thoughts or whatever research from your little notes that you took today, you can build on that tomorrow at the brunch. Next week at the brunch.
Trust me, you're gonna have some brothers that
You'll have some time.
You're just gonna have some brothers that are just knowing that's gonna be all you can eat. They'll be there.
Yeah.
They'll be there. They'll definitely be there.
Exactly. Any other announcements, Harold?
This will be doing our summer solstice walk on the 21st, which should be at the Moon Valley. That's June 21st. And
So that's in Montreal?
Huh?
That was the one in Montreal?
No, June 21st will be the summer solstice walk here at Moon Valley, June.
Okay.
And then more than likely, the last week in May, May 20th and 30th, we might be in Montreal, should be in Montreal, doing a lecture. Our brother down there, Jid, has said that he's coming to a pocket of reawakening Moors. So he's calling for us to go down there to sort of
Deal with the matters.
Deal with the matters, so to speak. So that would be at the end of this month, end of May. And then we have our barbecue July 6th on the island.
Memory serves as should. Summer sun has me feeling oh so good, so good. I've been raised in the hood. Na, 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 na. Summer sun has me. Summer sun has me feeling oh so good, so good.
out of here. Father on the left, two on the right. Allah, the Father of the universe. Allah, the Father of the universe. Father of love. Father of love. Truth. Truth. Peace. Freedom. And justice. Allah is my protector. My guide. And my salvation. By night. And by day. Through his holy prophet. Lord Drawley. Islam.
And just to let you guys know,
Thanks, Morris.
4 hours over there, or 3 hours, I never even saw any of this. I just caught, I guess, obviously I caught the third part. The third part was what was pretty much more current to us. And still all of it seems very,
Yes.
kind of like,
Very.
yeah, 4 parts of the review.